Good evening and welcome to the Tata Steel Round 5 wrap-up. Yesterday was a rest day. Some players were out playing football, other sports, and some others have been home resting. Today we will follow young Krzysztof Duda against Artemiev, a very exciting game that ended up with a draw, and of course the young Ferrugia that beat Giri. And he is actually back in the lead with Wesley So after this round. And then we will end today's wrap up with our own Grandelius from the Vikings. So let's start with the first game and see what happened. Jan Krzysztof played d4 and Artemiev answered with Slav. And so far everything looks slow and solid and nothing particular, but shortly this game exploded completely. And Duda took with e takes d4. This is a little bit more active play and aggressive choice. He could actually take with the knight also and try to play for a square on f5 to plant the knight, and maybe play with b3 and put the bishop on b2 instead. But then he is also allowing black to put pieces on both c5 and e5. And he took with the pawn just to remove these opportunities for Artemiev. And at the same time he wanna bring the bishop back out on the dark squares to either g5, f4 over time, and try to create some kind of more active game. Artemiev is hitting the bishop and Duda went back, and Artemiev planted a piece on d5. So when you have a Solani here on d4, e5 and c5 are covered, but then there's a nice square on d5 for the black pieces. And Jan Krzysztof continued the development. And it feels a little bit more comfortable to play white here. You get some space advantage. You can maybe have plans like a3, queen to d3, and then bring the bishop back to c2 and try to do checkmate here on h7. For example, we can show a few moves here, and then trying to take on d5, f6, and then checkmate on h7. And then maybe black got to play g6 and weaken up the dark squares around the king. So, but there's a lot of other ideas. Maybe just bringing in the knight on e5, putting rooks on d and e file. And we can see here that Duda put the first rook on e file. And it's always better bringing the f rook to e instead of a. Then you have the option to either put a rook on d1, or if you want you can double up on the e file. And in chess it's always important to keep all the possibilities open and decide what you want to do later, because then it's harder for your opponent to try to understand your ideas and what you want to achieve. And we can see here that Artemiev continued with bishop e6, developing, and Duda put a rook on e5. And it's very hard for Artemiev to threat this rook, or he can play, for example, bishop d6, but Then he wanna bring it back over time, for example. Maybe even playing something like rook to e2, doubling up. There might be some tactics also, for example, taking this knight or taking here. Let's start like this maybe. Um, Sacrificing is probably not the best way. But let's say going back. But the other way to attack the rook can be, for example, knight to d7. And then white is still keeping the activity, taking here. If he takes with the knight, sometimes maybe even taking the bishop. And just having different kind of strategies, even either attacking on h7, jumping in on f7. And there's a lot of tricky things that black got to watch out with. And Artemiev played queen to d7 just to cover everything, and even moved the queen from the pin. So rook to e1 and rook to e8. So just trying to balance as much as possible. But still white got the more active position here. And he's moving the bishop from the dead diagonal from a2 to g8 down to b1 to h7, because here he might threat mate soon on h7 and try to weaken up the king, especially when Artemiev moved the bishop back to d8. That means that he's even further away from g7 and protecting the king. And bishop to h6. This is a very interesting move. He's just giving away this piece, and suddenly there's not that many good moves here for black. The simple threat is rook to h5. Let's say something like this, and it's impossible to protect the checkmate on h7. Taking on h5 is checkmate, but also not taking would probably lead to checkmate after bishop takes h7, moving, and checkmate on h8. You can put the piece here and give the queen, but it's also losing. So Artemiev can't take the bishop. But at the same time, in this position, yeah, giving away the bishop maybe is not the best. He can just play regular moves. Something like a3, queen d3, and building up the attack. Artemiev moved the knight back, and you want to place it either on g6 or f5 to try to protect the king even more. And Duda is jumping in with the next knight. And Artemiev is protecting f6 with his bishop, so it's no good idea to take there. Then he's losing tempo and the bishop is threatened. So to play solid here, Duda could either go back to g5 or f4 and slow play it with a slight advantage, some initiative in the game. But that's not Duda. Duda is not slow playing, he's attacking, and he just gave away the bishop on g7. If, for example, king takes g7, the queen will enter and Duda would most certainly have won this game. It's not that easy for black to cover all squares, and yeah, For example, let's say he plays something like this. In this position, maybe even taking here. I'm not sure. It looks funny. He got to take the queen and take the rook. But yeah, black will get away with this. Even simply taking, got the square here. And he's probably getting out. Yeah, it looks like that, but it's very complicated here. But the queen sacrifice was probably not the best way forward. He can maybe even... I like the sacrifice, so let's see what he can do. Maybe even taking here. Pawn takes. Yeah, this was not winning either. But there are simple ways forward. You can just move the queen, give this bishop, and take here. And just exchange everything, be pawn up, and simply having a dominating position. For example, something like this. And this is a clear advantage for white. So taking the bishop was not the best alternative. He had to take the knight first to cover g5 with the bishop, and at the same time he threatens the queen. And this might have been something that Duda overlooked even when he started his calculations in the beginning of this variation, because now it feels like he don't have that much compensation. Even if he brings up the rooks, he's piece down, the queen is entering, but sure, now he can threat, for example, rook to h4. So if we just make moves here, it's threatening mate, taking the rook is a checkmate, and if we place something else, it's creating a lot of trouble here. Maybe just entering with the rook. Or even another move, like rook to g4 is even better, hitting both the knight and the pawn, and it's impossible to cover both. For example, if he takes the rook, it's checkmate. So let's see what happened. He played the correct way. He played f5 just to close the diagonal of the white square bishop. And after rook g4, simply bishop f6, and that was covered. But there was maybe another way, because in this case, he can just start running with the king. So taking here, maybe bishop got to take, and if he plays king h8, he's checkmate, but king f7. And he will be a chased king, but there's no proper way forward here. How will white checkmate if black just hide the king? This knight is attacked by the pawn, and so he can protect it and go for a checkmate on e4. But it seems like black got one more move and can run back with the king to b8. So for example check, king is running, and now it's very difficult for white. He's a complete rook down, and there's no proper counterplay. And if we go back here, after taking and king f7, he can maybe give a check, and then black starts running again. The same idea, doing checkmate, queen in between, and the king is hiding, taking the queen, and this would end up with the end game where it seems like black got the bishop pair, but he's 3 pawns down, and still the bishop pair will dominate the board. He can start attacking the knight. When the knight runs, then go and start picking up some pawns. So this is completely winning for black. And I'm actually surprised that Artemiev missed this. He was maybe afraid of getting checkmate, but he should have enough time to calculate these variations. So he played bishop f6. He might have seen a win here also, but yeah, maybe missed something. Knight to g5, threatening mate on h7 again. And Artemiev took it. And now suddenly white got really nice control and very dangerous pin over here against the king. d5, sacrifice the pawn just to open up a little bit more. And for example, bishop takes. Then this might be a very dangerous continuation. He got to take the bishop, and then either taking this rook or taking this rook, because taking on e8, queen takes, it's a checkmate. And not taking but retrieving, then it's still a pawn up, it's dangerous around the king, and nice initiative for white. He can maybe even pick up another pawn, and these 3 pawns will start running. So after d5 he got to take with the pawn, and bishop to a4. So if the queen takes the bishop, it's checkmate again. And he had to move, so the rook was hanging. And here we can see also that white is keeping the tense and initiative against the king. This bishop on e6 is looking like a big pawn. And at the same time, he's actually allowed to take on e6 and grab the 2 pieces back for the rook. The queen is more active. He can start chasing some pawns on the queen side. These 2 pawns are very weak. The king is completely open and very weak, while white is safe. Got only 2 islands of pawns. The king can hide, for example, on h2 with g3 or just where it is. There are no proper weaknesses in the white position. And Artemiev plays queen to f7. He wants to exchange the queens because then he's not in danger anymore. And if he calculates the pawn endgame correct, then it's good to change them. And Duda took the queen. And the game ended in a draw, so I believe it was wrong to take the queen. There must have been a miscalculation from Duda. He could, for example, just keep it by queen d6, threatening b8 check and picking up the a7 one, blocking everything here, and it's really uncomfortable to play black. Even if you somehow might be able to save the draw, let's say a6 to start with, then just moving the king to g7, g8. Yeah, white can even maybe just run with the pawn to h6, h5 to stop this one from advancing and just stay here and hold it. But, well, I don't believe it's enough for black to save a draw here. The dark squares are very weak, and sometimes it might be possible for white to jump up with the king to f4, for example. And it's only white playing for two results, win or draw. But let's see how it ended after the queen exchange. Seems like Artemiev is playing correct. So if Duda run to pick up the d-pawn, then Artemiev is faster over here. And black is winning. So king to g3. That was an interesting move, because now he is allowing black to play d3 and think, oh, I'm gonna enter with the king, pick up these ones and win. But then there is a check, he got to run back, and white is running to pick up the d-pawn. But even in this position it's possible to play a move like king e5, and we are back in the game. So king g3, and this might have been one position that Duda calculated wrong, because if he could do a move like king f4 and after d2 get this pawn, jump to e2 somehow, then Artemiev would be one move too slow. But unfortunately for Duda, he couldn't do that, and this is a draw. They're closing off the queen side, and after king h3, that is the last chance for Artemiev to somehow try to win the game. If Duda will play king f5, then king g3 is chasing away the king. He's always one tempo ahead. And black is winning. But Duda didn't allow this. He just followed the king, and they agreed on a draw. Because he's just following. Going up, then he's following. And in this position, then black got only one square, and it's going back. And then this is winning for white, because now white is one tempo ahead, and the same way picking up the a5 pawn before black picks up the a4. Very interesting game, going a little bit both ways. Ended up maybe in a fair draw after both players missed their chances. Maybe Artemiev having the biggest advantage when he had the opportunity to run with the king, but overall it seems like a fair result. So let's go back to the man of the hour and the young guy joining the lead. Ferrugia against Giri. So let's see what happened in this game. We have Ferrugia playing d4. Usually he likes to play e4 and try to create tactical positions. But Giri is very well prepared, knows a lot of theory, and Ferrugia maybe had too much respect to play the aggressive and critical options against Giri. So he tried to play something much slower. You can see here early exchange on d5 and bishop e5. Giri want to grab the bishop pair, and he actually got both bishops. But he had to pay with his pawn structure, so a weak pawn on f7, h7 and h5. While Ferrugia got two big islands of pawns. And it's a pretty close position where the knights can jump around, so now it's starting to move on to a tactical position where Ferrugia can create something with his knights. At the same time, Giri is opening up the position completely and trying to dominate the board with the bishops. Not really sure if the choice going to e2 with the knight was the correct one for Ferrugia. He should maybe go to f3 instead and try to maneuver the other one around to f4. But he chose e2, rook to d1, creating some possibilities to play e4 sometimes. And Giri played d4. So for the moment there is no threat on the knight because the queen is pinned. So he got to first move the queen. Again, not really sure how Ferrugia want to place his knights, if he want to make a block on the white squares, or maybe try to jump by g3 to f5, because h4 is coming very quickly and you don't want to put the knight out on h5, because now it's completely off without any squares. And at the same time he want to push the pawns in the center, f4, e4, so a knight on d3 would be nice. Knight f4 and bishop e5. This is a move again where a player is losing tempos. So when placing the bishop on e5, it's easy to target it, for example with knight to d3. And then the bishop got to move again, and Ferrugia got a nice tempo with knight to d3 and then able to move this knight from c3. So maybe a better option for Giri would be, for example, moving the queen, targeting the knight, and then slowly building up the queenside attack. For example, knight here, b6, trying with c5, or just opening up some squares for the light square bishop. And even possibilities to just run with the a-pawn. Depends on if, for example, Ferrugia want to move this knight and place it on d3, then it's interesting to place the white square bishop on e6 sometimes and put it on g8. Let's say something like this. Put the other one on g7, cover everything and have two really nice diagonals and just run with the queenside pawns. But he didn't move the queen. He started with bishop e5, and that was a very important tempo for Ferrugia. Then he went back to g7, so he could actually have went back to g7 maybe already here. Because after taking this one, maybe moving the queen. Okay, then the bishop is hanging. And the question is if he somehow can catch this knight on g7. Probably not. White is getting a slight advantage here, because he can jump out to f5. So let's see what happened after bishop e5. Went back, and Ferrugia got his knights to d3 and e2, and have prepared everything to start running with the e pawn and f pawn, and try to follow up with the knights to support the pawns. h4 and h3, stopping the pawn from advancing and weakening up the king. Ferrugia is offering an exchange, so taking this one, maybe even taking with the rook instead of the knight, targeting the pawn on h4, and the king is very open and weak. So this would be nice for Ferrugia, just targeting the king, even entering with the knight, and he removed one of the bishops, so it's easier to play. He got at least the dark squares to play against. And Giri didn't take it, he was covering his own pawn, and now it's a threat to take on e5, so Ferrugia covers it with f4. And start jumping around with the knights. Giri got to move the queen, because if he would take immediately on f4, the queen is hanging. So he started with queen e7, and now it's a threat to take on f4 with check. Ferrugia moved the king, and Giri took the pawn. And Ferrugia is pushing for a queen exchange, because he hopes that this pawn will be very strong, this one is weak, and this one is weak, so he will at least get a pawn back. That was the idea by playing king h1, because then Giri don't have time to move his bishop back to h6. So after the queen exchange, Ferrugia even get the pawn back, and now the e pawn is starting to be a little bit dangerous here. Still a very balanced and equal position, but Giri got to watch out a little bit. He should maybe try to exchange a knight already here, and keep the white square bishop, because the king got a nice square on g7 and coming closer, maybe even playing rook to e8 first, then bringing the king. Or maybe even also rerouting this bishop over to the other side. Somehow maybe to g3, if it's possible. Let's say something like this. And then the white king got some problems, and this one will become a target on e5. So it's very important to try to coordinate the bishops without creating targets for the knights. Bishop h6 and then knight f5. So now he caught one bishop at least, Perugia, and this is making the life much easier for white. He got a dangerous pawn, and knight and rook are usually dangerous when the king is stuck on h8. And this seems to start becoming like a technical win for white because he got the rook behind the pawn and he can bring his king easily to pick up another pawn, which should be enough to win. So Giri got to create something very fast on the queen side or get up here before the white king. And we can see here Farrugia is attacking h5. Giri got to go back. For example, if he goes here, takes, and then maybe retrieving, we will get the same position as in the game. The king is coming. If he takes here, there is a check and exchanging the rook, but maybe even better taking the pawn, and these two pawns are winning the game. If he takes with the king, then there's a check and he can exchange the rook. So we can go back and see what happened. Rook to e7 and Perugia got to take a pawn here. You should maybe play something like king to g5, try to hold it together. But then it would probably be the same with rook g5. If the king goes to h5 to cover the pawn, then it's easy for the white king to advance in the f-file and win the game with the e-pawn. So it's a very hard endgame for Giri here. He maybe got to go into this, and this seems to be a lost endgame because the king is in this square here, so he can always reach the c-pawn, and he will create the passed pawn on the king side. Maybe the right way forward for Giri was to put the pawn on c5, the other one on b6, just to have a longer road for the white king to go to enter. Might have been the last shot to somehow try to reach in time back with his king after he's been here and picking up the last pawn. Let's say c4, h. Maybe even he got to run with the king. Ah, he got to stop the pawn, so let's say a4. And then b3, just set up. Because then he will be in the square. And then continue on the king side. So it should be winning whatever Giri does. Or that's at least my feeling. But this was probably the easiest way forward. Now he's just running with the king. And Giri gave up because there is no chance anymore. Alireza is just picking up the pawns and winning the game with the b-pawn. A very interesting game. Chances for both here also. The bishops from Giri were very strong, but It feels like he gave an important tempo with bishop e5, and then Alireza kept up the pressure, and Giri went wrong when entering the endgame and allowing Alireza to have a rook behind the pawn, because that was very hard to defend, and it seems like it was already lost in that position, is at least my assumption. So let's go to the challengers and the game of Grandelius. He had a good rest day, at least it looked like that. He won today and is back on 50%. Hopefully he can keep up the good work and get back into the top of the tournament. So let's see how he won that game. On the other side of the board was Max Warmerdam, a young player from the Netherlands, and Nils tried to play a little bit more positional today and slowly tried to outplay his opponent. A solid setup for both players. There are many ways forward here. He can maybe even start with the knight and try to play both e4 and c4. Maybe even starting with b3, c4. But c4 immediately is not wrong. Nils is getting the initiative, and this is the opening he wanted. He got some center to play with. Still, the position of black is very solid, but it is white that got the opportunities to break in the center, that maybe push on the queen side. While, yeah, black is more or less defending and waiting for an invite or a good opportunity provided by white. And these are natural moves. Nils is taking the center, developing the rooks, even the bishop. b3 maybe was a little bit unnecessary. After rook c8 he should maybe just put the bishop on c3 and continue playing, putting the other rook on c1, a3 maybe, and b4. So b3 seems to be a bit unnecessary. For example, after a move like c5 he got the opportunity to play d5, create a target on c5. Dark squares for the pawns are never good with the dark square bishop, which don't have any proper file diagonals to play on. Okay, let's see, b3, queen a5, and bishop d2. Warmerdam got some pressure on both e4 and d4, so if pieces start being exchanged, then these two pawns might end up either being weak or strong. I'm not really sure if he should try to push for a queen exchange. And then quick c5. because in this position it's almost that white got to push e5 and then he get the square on d5, which is important. A very strong knight on d5 controlling a lot. He got the opportunity to play c5 very quick. And sure, he got two weak double pawns on the queen side, but at the same time a very strong knight and some initiative on the c-file. So it should be pretty balanced. But queen a3 is nothing wrong with. Bishop to c3 and he takes the d-file. Now Max is putting pressure on the d4 pawn. If the black square, or if the knights would be exchanged, then black would probably have a slight advantage by playing the bishop to f6, doubling up or tripling up on the d-file and putting a huge pressure on d4. So knight to e5. Max managed to exchange a pawn on d4. But at the same time he got the c-file, but Nils got rid of his weak pawn on d4. And got some initiative here, because in some positions he's able to play g4 and g5. He got pressure on f7. And black don't want to play a move like rook f8 to cover f7. That's just losing a lot of tempo. So queen a5 to put some pressure on the knight. One threat is, for example, taking the bishop. So if white plays g4, black can take the bishop, take back, and the knight is hanging. And two pieces will win the game for Max against the rook. For example, bringing the bishop to c5, having a really nice diagonal, and jump around with the knight. So Nils moved the knight and played a4 to secure the square for the knight. It can't be attacked by the bishop, and he's closing the c-file for Max. At the same time he's targeting d6 as a potential square for the knight in the future, after, for example, e5. b6, maybe a slow move, maybe he got to try to challenge somehow, but it's nothing directly wrong with it. Nils exchanged one light piece and jumped into d6. So now he's threatening both the rook and the pawn, and Max must take it. Nils got the pawn on d6, which is very dangerous, and he can try to play around this pawn and create something. For example, doubling up on the d-file, maybe bringing up a rook and attacking the king. And he got a lot of space. This pawn is also creating space and keeping the black heavy pieces far down on the board. So h6, just to create a square for the king. Rook c1, I'm not really sure why he did this. Maybe to exchange a rook, but at the same time it's maybe a little bit unnecessary. A move like rook to d4 is interesting. Placing the other one to d1, maybe creating some attacks. In some position, Nils maybe even can push the g-pawn, trying to open up around the king, because he got the heavy pieces involved. He always got the square on h1 for the king, or on h2. And bringing this rook to g1 sometimes. But okay, rook a to c1. Max brought the rook up too. Nils probably don't want to exchange here even if he's slightly better, because then he got to protect the pawn and the b file is starting to become a target for Max. But b4, this is also a very dubious move, because now he is weakening a4 pawn and then b4 is also becoming weak. And he don't want to put the queen on b3 and try to protect these pawns. He want to play active chess and create something. So after rook to f5, he's a bit in trouble. Maybe queen to b3 is a move, but, well, something like b5 and queen b6. It's not that fun, and it seems like white lost the advantage. After queen e4, the a4 pawn is falling. He got a square on d7 for the queen to retreat. He can maybe even create a passed pawn with a5 here. So it feels like Max is back in the game here. After g4, he played rook to d5. And this is the decisive mistake, I think. He could maybe have placed the rook somewhere else, for example g5, but sure, he don't have that many squares. But the queen is pinned here, so he can actually play something like rook c5. And Nils can never take because the queen is hanging. And for example, after a rook exchange, he takes back, and now the b4 pawn is in danger, and now black is taking over the game and maybe even winning. So rook c5 was probably the right way to continue. Let's say rook to a1 to target a7, queen retreats, Nils got to exchange, takes here, well, maybe even simply exchanging everything. And it's only black that can win, he's a pawn up. Still very drawish, but white is in trouble here. Yeah, the b4 move simply lost the a4 pawn, and it's not that easy anymore. But Nils was lucky, and he's the Swedish hope. So after rook d5 there's more hope for Sweden, and Nils could simply take 2 times, start targeting f7. For example, after queen takes, the rook is entering. Or maybe even starting with d7, and it's very hard to defend against rook c8. Feels almost like the only move is something like queen f8. But the rook is entering, the queen is joining, and rook c8 will be the killer move. But Max went back immediately. Nils exchanged and played d7. Now he is at least picking up a and b pawn, maybe coming with the king, but the black king is a little bit closer to the pawn. And this is more like a technical endgame that white should win. Because the black king need to hide somehow on h7. Let's say he plays something like this. And g5. And now he's gonna be on g7 and h7 and wait. So it depends on what Nils can create, but this pawn is very weak, so the king can go and pick it up. And in the end the rook need to move somehow. The king is advancing. The rook need to move again, and the king is advancing, and so on. So he will enter with the king, take this pawn, and win the game. So let's see how the game ended, and the brilliant technique of Nils. Max gave another pawn to try to create something. He exchanged that one, but because Nils got f and h, this is maybe even easier now. It is the same idea, the king is going to pick up the e-pawn, and after, for example, rook to b2, he will go with this one. Then give away the h-pawn. If he takes with the king, then the rook check and queening, and the game is over. So black got to take with the pawn, and then this pawn is queening. And as soon as black plays something like king g6, there is a check and queening. So it's impossible to cover everything for black, and that's why he gave up. So we have Nils back in the tournament on 50%. Let's hope he can have a really good, how do you say, maybe second third of the tournament now, round 5 to 8, and join the top. So we have a really interesting and exciting end of the tournament to follow. Thank you for following round 5, and see you tomorrow. Good night, everybody.